So welcome to Clever, the second webinar in Clever's Elevating EdTech series, picking the perfect EdTech business model and fundraising with Geoff Ralston. So I'm Dan. I'm the co-founder and chief product officer at Clever, and in a prior life, I was a teacher and tech director in Denver. And today I'm so excited to have Geoff Ralston as my second guest in Clever's Elevating EdTech series, because he's one of the people I've learned the most from in Clever's journey. Geoff's an amazing entrepreneur and product leader. He pioneered Yahoo Mail and sold a music company to Apple. And in 2011, Geoff focused his career on EdTech investing, founding Imagine K-12, the kind of premier EdTech accelerator, and helping companies like Clever, No Red Ink, Remind, and Class Dojo all grow and thrive. Now Geoff is a partner at Y Combinator, where his focus includes EdTech. And whenever Clever has a tough business strategy problem, we, and really me personally, we turn to Geoff for advice. So I can't wait for you all to learn from him as Geoff and I talk about business models and fundraising strategy today. So in a second, I'll ask Geoff to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what got him into EdTech and what Y Combinator education is all about. But before we do that, just a couple housekeeping details about the webinar. So I'll kick things off by asking Geoff some questions I'm really curious about. And we expect that'll take about 30 minutes. But then I'm going to hand the mic over to you. It's your chance to ask Geoff anything. As questions come up throughout the hour, please post them into the question tool and go to webinar. And you can also tweet at us. And for this webinar, we're actually going to prioritize the questions that get asked over Twitter. So if you tweet at Clever with the Elevating EdTech hashtag, we're monitoring that, and we will be bringing your questions to Geoff at the end in the second half of this webinar. The session will be recorded, so if you have your notebooks and pencils and are getting ready to furiously scribble notes down, you don't need to do that. You'll get a YouTube link in your email at the end of this. But we do encourage you to stay for the whole time to get a chance to ask your questions and engage with us live. So I think that's all of our logistics. So let's get things started. So just to kind of give some context here, about 7 years ago in summer 2012, Clever went through Y Combinator, and it was just an amazing experience for us as a company. We started we entered Y Combinator in 4 schools, and we exited the program in 1,000 schools. And we'll actually tell that journey in detail in a couple of weeks. I'm going to do a webinar with my co-founder, Tyler. But during that experience, Geoff was just incredibly helpful. He helped us focus on the right problems. He helped Clever get amazing growth, and he was absolutely essential in helping us raise an amazing seed round at the end of YC. And so, Geoff, I'd love to hand things over to you. Can you just tell our audience a little bit about the Y Combinator program today, what it's like?
Sure. Hey, Dan. Hello, everyone. This is Geoff. And first, I really can't believe it was 7 years ago that you guys went through Y Combinator. It's boy, a lot's happened since then, but it also seems like yesterday. So, Y Combinator has actually been around for about 14 years now. Our first batch was in 2005, and let me talk a little bit about the history of Y Combinator, and then talk a little bit about EdTech and Y Combinator, and this version of Y Combinator that I founded with Tim Brady in 2011 called Imagine K-12, which focused just on educational technology. So YC was founded in 2005, and it was founded on the premise that, in fact, the way VCs funded startups was not the only way you could do it. And in fact, what we do is we invest in a small amount of money in a lot of startups twice a year. We work sort of like a school for startups. We have a very simple deal. Unlike schools where you pay to go to the school, we actually pay you. We give $150,000 of seed funding, and in exchange, we ask for 7% of the equity of the company. We run twice a year in the winter and in the summer. We call them batches, from January to March and from June to August. As I mentioned, in 2005, we had 8 companies in our first summer of 2005 batch. In the batch that just finished, the winter 2019 batch, we had our concluding demo days in March last week. We had 205 startups.
And having been at that demo day, the thing that shocked me is you guys have grown, and the quality of the startups just has not dropped at all.
We hope so. I think the startups were fantastic. The breadth of companies that we're funding now in all sorts of different domains including education, obviously, but from biotech to enterprise to consumer software. It's really gone very, very broad. In fact, we funded over 2,000 startups now. And we have by far the largest community of startup founders in the world, over 4,000 founders, which is incredibly important because you can think of it as the largest founder support group in the world. It's amazing. And what's even more amazing is how connected those founders are to one another. You've probably found that yourself, Dan, and in your ability to reach out to other founders and get specific help on any issues you might be running into, or just have a community of people who are going through the same sort of issues that you're going through at any time during your startup.
Totally. It's both very practical, like many YC companies start out selling to other YC companies, as your early customers, getting feedback and all that. But it's also, the kind of like emotional support or the bond or just the kind of camaraderie is also huge.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, the YC companies now have a valuation of well over $100 billion, which is a pretty good measure of, I think, how effective YC is at helping companies, at helping choose the right founders and helping those founders really succeed. I want to mention a few other things that we're doing now that's a little different than we've done in the past. We have a program called Startup School, which we've taught for the last couple of years. We'll teach again this year, which is an open, free, massively open online course for startups. Last year, we had over 15,000 startups actually register for the course. 10,000 actually ended up starting the course, and then of those, over 50% finished the course. That will take place in August of this year. We also have a program we call our Series A program, which is similar to our seed program, but helps companies that are at the next level of growth, that are ready to raise a Series A, ready to raise many millions of dollars, and ready to take their company to a whole different stage. And lastly, for those companies that are really taking off, we have a growth program, which we do in the context of our continuity fund, which actually funds growth stage companies. And these are companies with valuation, with at least 40 to 50 employees and valuations that are starting to approach in the 9 figures. So we've really expanded how YC works with companies from the very earliest stages to the latter stages of growth and success.
Yeah, and I can personally attest, I've been a startup school TA and loved that experience. Clever went through the growth program, and I know we really appreciated it. Wish we could have had the Series A program when we were raising our Series A. It would have made our life a lot easier. Cool. Well, thank you, Geoff, for introducing YC. But I want to kind of ask you a question that's always I've always been curious about, which is, how did you get passionate and excited about EdTech? You were kind of operating, working at Yahoo, doing startups that had nothing to do with education. How did you get excited about this space?
Yeah, and I did want to talk about how EdTech has now become part of what we do at YC. I'd always been interested in education. Actually, my dad was a lifelong educator. Yep. He was a professor at SUNY Buffalo, where I grew up. He actually started the computer science department there. And although I have to admit, I was sort of oblivious when I was a kid. I went to public high schools and they all seemed pretty good. And I was fortunate enough to go to a really great post-secondary school. I got a great education, and it didn't occur to me until I started talking to my father about education that maybe my experience wasn't the same as as everyone in the United States, yeah, especially around the world. And my father started to push from computer science into math education and to think about how we taught math throughout the country. And that's when I really started to realize that in fact, really what education does, it did for me, is determine the future, right? Yep. It determines the future prospects of our children and our country. And the importance of that really struck me as I was thinking about what I was going to do after I left Yahoo in 2006. I really wanted to make a difference for the world, and what better difference could you make than in working with the future? And what better way to work in the future than education? So, so I got together with a bunch of folks to think about how we could create a startup that would do two things, that would begin to take the revolution that was happening in the connected world that I've been working on for a very long time, the fact that all knowledge and information was available all the time to everybody, including children, except in schools, which seemed weird. And also to recognize that the 21st century was a very, very different place, and that we ought to rethink how we deliver that knowledge and information to children, to everyone, to allow people to be ready for the change in the 21st century. So I got together with actually a couple of really cool people. This guy named Sebastian Thrun, and who was at Google, and a friend of his named Astro. Now,
I think I've heard of those guys before. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell a little bit. It was really interesting. We worked really, like, we put our heads together for several months, and in the end, we came up with a lot of ideas. But in the end, we concluded that you know, the infrastructure for the delivery of the sort of content that we wanted to deliver, and the services we wanted to bring to schools just wasn't ready, and that wasn't the battle we were about to fight. So we all kind of went off in our different directions. Sebastian ended up going back to Google and ended up founding one of the companies that we spent a lot of time talking about, Udacity, which obviously did great, and Astro, of course, eventually ended up at Google and running Google X.
Yeah.
And I went off. And I went off and invested in startups, ended up running a startup and selling it to Apple a couple of years later, and then it felt like the time was right. So that's when I founded the EdTech accelerator called Imagine K-12, which ran in parallel. I became a partner at YC at the same time, and it was really a sister accelerator to YC for 5 years into 2016, when YC had expanded enough and we realized that there was enough duplication of work that it made more sense to put Imagine K-12 and YC together. So Imagine K-12 became part of YC, and education, a vertical, I think you called it a matrix vertical within YC, where the education companies that we fund are interspersed throughout the batch, but also pulled out for specific programs for EdTech companies.
Yeah, that's awesome, Geoff. And so, you know, back in 2006, you, Sebastian, and Astro said, hey, you know, can't really find the right business model. You know, maybe the world's not ready for the kind of EdTech company that you guys wanted to build. But, you know, since then, we've seen EdTech companies come up, you know, have a lot of success, and you've, you know, shaped them and advised many of them. And so I'd love to hear your take for someone, you know, thinking about someone in our audience who maybe is really passionate about a problem, but isn't quite sure yet about how to turn that into a business or you know, a high growth business. What are some of the successful EdTech business models that you've seen? What are some of the ways that you can take that passion for education that you have and turn it into a really successful company?
Well, I will say first, okay, so there's plenty of business models that are working in EdTech, but I will say that the first thing to do when you're thinking about solving a problem in education is don't think about the business model. Think about making something that people want. That's YC's motto, and it's really fundamental that if you can create a product that adds huge value to some part of the educational ecosystem, that's the place you have to start. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, so how is it that I can create a sustainable business around this value that I'm delivering to people? And there's a number of ways people do that, right? There's actually this unique new thing that's happened, which is because teachers, like all of us, are connected, they start using things. You can get things directly into teachers' hands, you can deliver value to them, and then you can create this classic pull model into the enterprise of an educational institute by doing freemium or a free trial. And many companies are now doing this. You know, it's sort of equivalent to the way Slack gets pulled into enterprises where everyone starts using Slack, and then all of a sudden, the next thing you know, you start paying for it. And there's plenty of companies that have done precisely that. You know, there's companies like Class Dojo we talked about.
Yep.
This is an example. This was in our very first batch at Imagine K-12 in 2011. And one of the things that's the coolest about the way they grew is that it was just sort of classic viral growth. Teachers, turns out, not surprisingly, talk to teachers. And when they find something great, they talk about it. And, you know, we used to show this map. Actually, I shouldn't say we, Class Dojo folks used to show this map, and I guess we kind of borrowed it and then showed it ourselves to show the viral growth of their product. And, you know, it looked like the worst flu you can imagine. It took off over the United States and just, you know, became a tool that today is used in essentially every elementary school in the United States and many middle schools. It's really an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, and I think just looking at this list of some of the amazing companies that have come out of Imagine K-12, I'm thinking, what, 5 out of 6, I think everyone but Panorama has a free teacher product to get that kind of viral growth, to create awareness and create champions.
Right.
And then, you know, okay, so you have this amazing free teacher adoption, but you have to build a business. What are some of the ways that you've seen companies successfully turn that momentum into revenue?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot of ability for schools, especially nowadays, to pay for to pay for technology, to pay for tools, to pay for curricula, and that's sometimes done at the school level. Principals can write checks, so some companies sell directly to the institution, to the school. It's also done at the district level, and you can actually sell to the district level. That's more classic. It used to be, in fact, that you would only sell to the district level and seldom to the school level. But increasingly, you can sell directly to schools, and it really depends on the district. This is actually one of the hard things about selling to education that you can't ignore, is that there are 16,000 districts in the United States, and procurement for those 16,000 districts is particular to each district. So you have to learn. There's some gigantic districts that buy at the very top level. Companies like Panorama have been enormously successful in selling to some of those big districts. Companies like No Red Ink and Freckle have been very successful at selling both to districts and to individual schools. Yep. So there's a variety of models. Often, I should point out, there's hybrid models where you might do some freemium, you might do some particular deals with districts that have nothing to do with that you sell immediately. And it very much, I think the direction I would focus most people on is to be thoughtful and flexible. Do your math, figure out how you can build a sustainable business, talk to your potential customers as much as you can, and learn where the business opportunities are. I think that you guys actually are a fantastic example of that, Dan, because Clever figured out that, in fact, the right way for, you know, you guys had your login tool in almost every and dashboard in almost all these schools, and then figured out that it was on the business, the folks using your API that the business model worked best. So I think you have to be
some of the districts. Actually, Geoff, I don't know if you know this story, but that was an insight that we got on day one. Literally the first day that we started Clever, we were talking with Justin Su, the Goalbook founder and Imagine K-12 alum, and Justin said, Dan, you'd be crazy if you tried to sell Clever to schools. You've got to sell it to applications, and that, you know, that'll help you grow. It'll be the better business model. So thank you for indirectly giving us that great advice. It saved us, I'm sure, at least a couple of years of bashing our heads into the wall.
And you don't have Goalbook up there, but they are still growing strong. I happen to see Daniel, the other founder of Goalbook, and they're still doing great, selling directly to schools. And again, I do think there's also this fact that things have evolved since then, and schools have more budget to pay. So many schools have directors of technology and CTOs who help them make decisions of to what tools and software and technology purchase, and figuring out who those people are, getting in contact with them, understanding who makes buying decisions in a school, in a district, are critical to all these business models. And of course, there are other business models that are evolving. It turns out that parents will sometimes pay for specific tools that increase that they believe improve their kids' prospects and help their education. So
Yeah.
there's plenty of models. Quizlet's a great example of parents or students. When students pay, it's usually the parents, of course, paying for tools that enhance their experience. And there's even other models that are sponsorship or ad based, which can work well. I think, again, be flexible. Keep first in mind that whatever your business model is, the product value that you deliver is most important, and don't let the business model get in the way of that, and you'll probably be on the road to success.
Yeah, I'm with you. You can deliver value and not have a business model, but you can't have a business model if you're not delivering value. So let's say
the end. I was just going to say, the end goal, and it's important to keep this in mind, to be explicit about this, is that you're trying to build a sustainable business. And sustainable businesses are simple. In the end, they bring in more money than they cost.
Yep.
And as you're going to deliver enormous value, but in the end, you want to do that scalably and sustainably. And so keep that in mind. Do your math. Understand if you're going to have to build a sales force, because often you will. Sometimes you can just have people call in and buy your product, but a lot of times you're going to have to have people go out and talk to the folks in schools and districts and help that happen. There's great examples of this in our portfolio. Mystery Science, which sells curricula to elementary schools, is doing an awesome job of getting their incredible videos and lessons in schools across the country. There's a lot of examples to learn from out there, and so and luckily they're out there to see. So go look and learn and pick the right model that works for you.
Yeah, I love that, Geoff. So let's kind of thinking, to maybe one of our audience members who has, they picked the problem they want to solve. They've made something people want. They've got users who are really excited. Maybe they've even started to test out a business model, whether viral teacher adoption can turn into principal sales or something like that. And if you're thinking about someone who's at that early stage of just starting to figure things out, they might be wondering, when's the right time to join an accelerator? What would be the right time to apply to Y Combinator? And what advice would you give them there?
Well, now, right away. It turns out our application deadline was yesterday for the summer of 2019 batch, but that's okay. We accept late applications. It's better to get your application in time. Your probability of getting in is higher, but we'd be less than intelligent not to accept a fantastic company that applied afterwards. So we look at all the late applications as well. You can apply anytime. But look, I think once you've raised a Series A and have institutional investors at that level, it's difficult to justify with those investors the dilution that an accelerator requires, and the time spent in an accelerator. It's better when you're searching for product market fit, or you're searching for growth, or you're really thinking through at a pretty high level the strategic direction of the company to be part of Y Combinator. And I think we add the greatest value. That we have funded companies post Series A, but it is a definite an exception.
Yeah, totally. And just if people are in the audience are saying, "Oh man, I missed the deadline. There's no way I have a shot." I do remember a little tiny company in the YC Summer 12 batch that applied, I think, quite late. They were called Instacart, but somehow you guys let them in, and I think they're doing pretty well right now. So
there's lots of examples of great companies that applied late. So
and writing the application will even help clarify your thinking, help you think about what your biggest challenges are. There's never a downside to doing it, so I totally recommend it. But let's talk about.
Thank you for pointing that out, Dan. Sorry to interrupt, but it's also free. And I do think that is a point, that just going through the YC application is a useful exercise. This is what I told all of our startup school companies last year. It's a useful exercise in thinking through the issues that are going to confront your company. So you should do it.
Yeah. So Geoff, one of the things you mentioned that YC can really help with is helping you go through that journey of finding product market fit. And so if I'm a startup founder, maybe I'm in an accelerator, maybe not, how do I know when I found product market fit? What does that really feel like or look like?
Yeah. Product market fit is I think an often misunderstood term. Paul Graham used to say it's when you have delivered really a quantum of utility to a customer, when you've really built that thing that people want, that in a sense they can't live without anymore. One way to know you have product market fit is that you grow without trying. There was a great phrase that a Y Combinator founder who was interviewed, Ushma Garg, who was interviewed during startup school, said is that she considers the product market fit to live at the intersection of growth and retention. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's a brilliant way to think about it, because when you have product market fit, the customer doesn't leave, which adds to your growth, obviously. And by its very nature, the product metrics grow. And by the way, we didn't say this, but early on, picking the right metric, hopefully just one metric, in almost every case, just one metric, and using that to focus on, and using that to be the determinant as to whether you're making the right choices, choosing the right priorities, building the right things, is a great focus for the company. And that actually can go for a very long time in the growth of your company. I'm sure you guys did that at Clever, whether it was number of schools. The best metric is always revenue, but it depends. But really focusing on that, that's how you know that you have product market fit. And conversely, spending money on growth, time, effort, and money on growth prior to having product market fit is a classic failure scenario. And you should approach that decision with great care.
Yeah, you're totally right. I think one of the best decisions we made with your advice during Y Combinator was pick a number. For us, it was number of schools using Clever. Make that number grow every single week. And we're actually going to be telling that story, Tyler and I, in just a couple weeks as webinar number 4. So if folks are interested in hearing that, make sure you sign up for that webinar. It's going to be awesome. So Geoff,
focus on a startup, Dan, is so critical. And using tools that enable you and the entire company to focus are I would say, critical to success.
Yep. Cool. So let's say that you found some of that product market fit, or you're getting early signs of it. What does it take if you're an EdTech company to raise funding? Let's think of raising a seed round or maybe a Series A. What do investors need to see?
That's always such a hard question as to what investors need to see. This isn't really different for EdTech companies than for any other company. Investors need a story about the future. Mm-hmm. And the better you are about telling that story about the future, the better probability you will of getting funding. The parts of that story that can be really important are, of course, persuasive evidence that your story might actually be true. And that's the best persuasive evidence is some sort of traction, revenue, et cetera. So leaving aside the Series A for a moment, if you have real evidence that you either have product market fit or that you have an idea that is likely to get real scale, then investors are going to be interested. If you can talk about how the opportunity for your product is very large and you can do that convincingly, then investors will be interested in. Look, I have this sort of mantra about investing to think about when you're or fundraising, when you're in your earliest stages, it's really about the dream. And you're gonna describe your dream, and you're going to try to get someone else to join you in that dream, that investor. As you move to Series A and Series B, you're really going from your dream to DCF, and DCF means discounted cash flows, which means they're going to start valuing your company based on real revenue and profit metrics.
Well, you say that, Geoff, and we've got some companies hitting the public markets that are still maybe running their IPOs a little bit on the dream more than on their profits. But I think
it's an interesting. No. You make an interesting point. Like, no matter what, even as you get closer, so in the dream you don't have much in terms of actual numbers for revenue and future. And when you do a Series B, C, or even you go public, you still have lots and lots of data, and it's about discounted cash flows, but at the same time you're still telling a story about the future.
Yep.
So there are companies that even get there without that much in terms of revenues or profits anyway, but they're still telling a story about the future. Look at Amazon, how long it was before Amazon ever turned a profit. But Bezos was really good about talking about a future where Amazon would dominate so many areas of commerce. It turned out it was a pretty good story and pretty accurate.
And lots of intermediate data that show that they're getting there. Just want to give a quick shout out to our audience. We are going to turn things over to you in terms of questions in just a couple minutes. So if you have other topics, please make sure to tweet them at us. Hashtag elevating EdTech. Thank you, Jennifer. You're first up on the questions. You've got some great questions on Twitter. And then you can also, of course, put them in the go-to webinar control panel. Geoff, one thing I think we just probably should mention before on fundraising is just that, you don't have to take venture, and if you do, there's sort of a set of obligations or expectations that come with that. There's lots of ways to fund a company, and it doesn't have to be raising a big seed or Series A. Any quick thoughts on that? I know you had some interesting thoughts around kind of venture math when we were preparing for this.
So look, venture math is something worth Googling and learning about. Look, there are also two sorts of investors: angels, and angels almost exclusively invest in seed rounds, and institutional or venture capitalists. Angels have a different set of criteria, but just focusing on venture capitalists for the moment, they will not invest in a company in almost every case unless they believe that company can return their fund. In other words, simply put, that company can be a very large company, probably $1 billion company.
Yeah.
And if you can't make that case, if that's not the dream, the story you're telling, then the probability of them investing is very low. Now, most angels are sort of like that, but angels also invest for way more emotional reasons. Angels are investing their own money on their own behalf. You have to remember that institutional investors are investing on behalf of limited partners who are looking for a very specific return.
Yeah.
And so they have a different set of criteria. It's worth learning more about that. And just to be really crisp, what this means is if you have a $50 or $100 million exit for your startup, which might be like a huge, great thing, you might become wealthy and you might create immense value and have millions of users and all great. That's kind of a lose for the VC. That's weird, but that you might have returned some money to them, but not enough to make a big difference. Again, it's worth learning a little bit about that. But there are other alternatives. I was just actually literally yesterday talking to Tom Preston Werner from GitHub, and they bootstrapped that company to a multi-billion-dollar company without taking financing until 4 years in to the company. And so it is possible to bootstrap a company, and some EdTech companies have done a great job doing that. It's complicated, right? Because the thought experiment that I always tell folks to go through is if you do have a choice between, if you have a choice, right? This is an important distinction, but if you have a choice between raising venture funds and bootstrapping, and you think that someone else might be raising that instead of you, and you don't, and that they'll have a big advantage, think about that. Think about someone else having millions of dollars in the bank and competing with you versus you bootstrapping and struggling, every month and every year. So it's a little harder to grow fast.
Yeah.
The reason a startup is a startup, Paul Graham defined as something, as a company that grows very quickly, is because you have to spend money in general to do that.
Yeah, this is awesome, Geoff. Well, we had some amazing questions from our audience. So let me just wrap this up with my final question, which is, what are your best reads? What are the things that you recommend every EdTech entrepreneur should dig into to educate themselves to be an amazing to bring their company to success?
Yeah. I think you should spend not that much time reading and a lot of time doing and building and talking to customers. Yeah. But I do think that, look, I think there's an amazing amount of great content in there. One thing I will recommend, first of all, is go to startupschool.org, which is YC Startup School site, and go to the library there. And there's an immense amount of content. A lot of it is things like Paul Graham's essays. They have aged really well. His Default Alive, his essay on Formidable, on the equity equation, on fundraising. There's lots. Not to self-promote, but I wrote a blog post with Michael Seibel on essential startup advice that's really short and really good. I also wrote a guide to seed fundraising, which I think is pretty useful. Aaron Harris wrote a guide to Series A. There's a whole bunch of posts. The YC's posts are not the only great posts out there, but they're probably enough. There are a bunch of books out there that.
And this was, we loved YC, but I think a lot of YC was telling us ideas that were available for free online. Many of them we read before we got into YC. So I think it's just, I love that you guys aren't you're sharing with the world.
And so just to interject there, we think about that, like what if we make ourselves useless by putting everything we think out there? And you know why it doesn't matter, Dan?
How's that?
It doesn't matter because it turns out you have to say all these things a dozen times to entrepreneurs because, and that's not like a criticism in any way of entrepreneurs. It's because entrepreneurs have their minds full of a million things, a million priorities, a million things to do, and a lot of these ideas are fairly counterintuitive. And so you need to stress and say some of them are just situational. And when they're in that situation, they say, "Oh, now I see what you mean." So I think it's not a risk to us to have some of that knowledge or all of that knowledge out there.
So we've packaged up some of Geoff's top reads, his top links into a handout. It's available through GoToWebinar. We'll also send a link to it at the end of this webinar. But let's get to people's questions. So just really quick housekeeping on my end. We've got 2 more webinars in the series. We're talking to an Imagine K-12 company, PureGrade, their founder, David Kofod-Wind, talking about acquiring teacher users for free on April 9th. It's going to be amazing. And then I'll be in dialogue with my co-founder, Tyler, talking about our YC experience and Clever's path to product market fit on April 16th. They'll be great. So don't forget to register at clever.com/elevating-edtech. But let's turn over to our audience Q&A. First question I'd like to start with is from Jennifer over Twitter. Jennifer, thanks for the great questions. She said, "Hey, Geoff, is it realistic for an EdTech startup today to have a freemium model for teachers? The channel has gotten really crowded. Like, what's the marketing budget that you need to ensure success? And is that even is that just maybe skyrocketed in the past few years? So, what do you think, Geoff? Have we reached kind of peak freemium? Is it harder and harder today to get teachers to adopt your new tool?"
Oh, for sure. The good news for schools is there's a lot of choice and a lot of great software tools. The bad news is there's so much choice. It's hard for them to navigate. It's why they're starting to bring on directors and directors of technology and CTOs. And of course, that does make it harder for applications and new companies to stand out. Look, I don't think about this in terms of marketing budget. Not in the beginning. There's something a YCB called the Buchheit rule, which is the most important thing when you begin is to find 10 or maybe 100 users who really, really love you. And I think that's something you do I'll refer to another YC mantra, which is to do things that don't scale. So don't spend marketing, don't do any of that until you are sure you have product market fit. And the way you get that is by hand going to teachers, going to schools, and talking to them directly.
Yeah, I love even, you know, the trick, like, you know, try to take your product away from people. Tell people that you're shutting it down, and see what they do. And if they yell and scream and get mad at you, you know, that's a sign that you've really built something that they want. I love that. And I do think, to Jennifer's point, like there are certain parts of EdTech that are very saturated, but also tons of challenges that teachers face where there's really no tech yet to solve their problems. So I think that there's, you know, maybe we need a little bit more creativity than we did 6 years ago, but I think there's tons of opportunities. Next question I'd love to take from, and I almost forgot this. And with Clever, we've got this new product and platform called the Clever Library that is all about helping free and freemium applications get distribution. Teachers can adopt them with a click and push it out to their classrooms. And the data we've seen from the Clever Library is that teachers are not slowing down. They are still going out, discovering new software and new tools, and we've just seen kind of absolutely tremendous usage of that path so far.
And Dan, I'll just point out or restate something I mentioned earlier. Is teachers are very viral.
Yeah.
So you'll know when you have a tool that teachers really love because other teachers will just start using it within the same school and between schools because they talk.
Yeah, I've got another great question from Twitter from my great friend Gautier. And he was asking, you know, well, there's kind of two challenges here. One is to, you know, get with freemium. One is to kind of get your free tool to scale, you know, really focusing on that viral adoption loop. But the other challenge is thinking about that monetization step. You know, can I actually, if I get 10 teachers in a school using a product, will it ever actually be able to turn into a sale? And he was kind of asking, like, you know, which one should you focus on first? Is it Freescale first, or is it monetization first? And maybe with the suggestion that if you haven't figured out monetization, getting Freescale might not actually ever, you know, contribute to a business model.
Yeah, look, I freely admit this is a very hard problem, and it will depend. And I've seen many cases of both. The one thing I will say is that you can focus on Freescale too long, and you can, if your expenses build too large and you have not enough time to convert that to a paying model, it can be a big problem. But the good news is that for the most part, scaling, again, it depends a little bit on what you're doing, but for the most part, scaling is pretty cheap. And so it's sort of a market share question. Do you go for market share first and then charge, or do you charge first and then go for market share? And again, it sort of depends on the business, and you know, that's why we do office hours at YC, to dig into the business and to figure out which makes the most sense. But you know, I'd say that for the most part, you want to start converting to pay when that revenue is actually going to be significant enough to make a difference in the trajectory of your business.
Love that. Another great question from Will on Twitter. He said, let's say you're building curriculum. On the one hand, you want to sell, but on the other hand, you want to know, hey, is my curriculum actually effective? Is it helping students learn? And how do you think about that kind of efficacy question as an early stage entrepreneur when, you know, there's so many things to think about, and oftentimes the traditional ways of measuring efficacy take so much money and take so much time?
Look, I think that if you're selling at a district level, a lot of times they will demand evidence of efficacy if you're selling curricula. And so I would argue that the more mature your company is, the more you're going to have to use some of the more traditional methods of showing efficacy. I think, though, at a school level, teachers are your best evidence of efficacy, because teachers know. Teachers will be able to determine whether a particular curriculum is working or not. I think a great example of that is one I used earlier with Mystery Science. The teachers know that the kids resonate with the lessons that are being taught because they're great and the kids are enthusiastic and they talk about it, and therefore the learning is obvious. And to the extent that in the early stages that's sufficient, I should say that differently. In the early stages, that will be sufficient, and that will be sufficient to get usage of the product.
I love that. Yeah, the first stages of efficacy is my life easier? Are my students happier? And the deeper research is something that you can use those early successes to then fund.
And teachers have a sense for whether kids are learning or not. And again, the administrators will need evidence. Teachers will have that evidence in hand.
Yeah. And I think, just to be really frank, and this might be a good thing, this might be a bad thing. In my experience, schools, that kind of evidence, that teacher, the anecdotal, how does it feel? How do your students react, tends to actually be more powerful in sales decisions than, cold, hard, data and p-values. I think that we, as humans, especially educators, we value story and our seen experiences sometimes more than the regressions.
In the end, if you talk to a director of technology at a school and you ask them how they make their decisions, they say, well, the teachers tell us, the teachers ask us, we talk to, they're our customers. And again, other directors of technology involved with curricula, it depends. Some of the curricula is EdTech and some of it isn't. But even if you have a head of curriculum at a school, they'll give you the same answer.
I love that. It's so true. So I've got a great question here from my friend Anir Ban. And he said, I work for a nonprofit that partners with schools on innovative R&D projects. Together with our school leaders, we come up with a lot of cool ideas and make a lot of scrappy tools using free products. I'm guessing they're, gluing Google Sheets together and doing things like that. And he's saying, would it be possible for that? How can they take those kinds of scrappy solutions and turn them into more products? Should this nonprofit maybe build their own application development team? Should they spin it off as a for-profit? How should they? What can they do with all these kind of challenges that need sort of tech solutions that they run into with their school partners?
Well, I guess it depends. There's a bunch of solutions that might already be out there, and it's worth taking a look. Like Hapara is a Magic A12 company that helps organize Google Docs for schools. Look, I think to actually build a product, you need focus. And whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit, you need a bunch of folks who are going to choose to build something. And the way you do that is you take all those things you're cobbling together, figure out which is the most important, which piece of it is delivering the most value. You do that by talking to the people who are using it, and then you have people who build that. Once you build something that you can characterize as an MVP, a minimum viable product, something that does deliver that quantum utility, that has that minimum amount of product market fit, then you can make a call as to whether to productize it and build a business of some kind around it.
Yeah, and if I'm a school and I'm like, I think this idea, I'm not ready to operationalize this. I don't want to be an entrepreneur right now, but I want, wouldn't it be amazing if some Y Combinator company focused on this idea? Is there any way that you get feedback from teachers or school leaders and use that to influence the companies you select, or even the ideas that maybe the folks going through YC or might think about?
I'd say once in a blue moon, we actually give ideas to companies, and then they take that idea and run with it. It's usually because for whatever reason, their idea hasn't worked out the way they wanted. But in general, look, I think the best ideas come from the entrepreneurs, and we don't claim to be the font of ideas. And what's more, to be successful in a company, you have to really love your idea. You have to wake up every morning thinking about the idea and thinking about the business and be really passionate about it. And the probability that someone has given you an idea and then you fall in love with it like that is pretty low. So it's almost always better if it's an idea that you're in love with and that has come from you or your team and evolved to be something that you really want to solve, because you got to really want it.
That makes sense. My Clever has all been about me solving the problems I ran into when I was a tech director. So
absolutely.
Juliet and Colette both have some really great questions around kind of that free to paid conversion and paywalls. They're asking things like, if you give something for teachers for free, well, why would anyone ever want to pay for it? Wouldn't that just be good enough? And how do you test kind of what your paid value offering is? Should you, run marketing experiments? Should you go fly out and visit people? So how have you seen companies successfully navigate that, what their paid offering should be in terms of the paywall and understanding their purchasers better?
Great question. So there was a company that was in precisely, an Imagine K-12 company that was in precisely this situation. They had tens of thousands of schools using their product and no one was paying. They had tens of thousands of schools using the product and tens of thousands of schools where multiple teachers were using the product. And so the question was, how do we know what do we do? And so I said, well, let's just run a thought experiment. Would every school, or if you asked every school to pay $50 a year for your product, how many would convert? And his answer was all of them. Well, okay, so if you were doing that, what state would your company be in? He said, well, we'd be profitable. I said, well, okay, so maybe that's not the right price, but how could you possibly figure out what the right thing to charge and when to charge is? And we talked about it. I said, well, why don't you go talk to 100 schools and start asking that question and figure out what would make sense for them, and then figure out, look at your data and figure out where is it that people start to use our product enough so that they would probably pay, and then we can ask that question. And what is the metric? What is the bar that they hit? Is it storage? Is it number of teachers? Is it frequency of usage? Is it number of kids? What is it that at that point we can say, okay, you guys, you've reached a new level and now it's time to pay? And how can we effectively do that? And how can we convince, create this paywall in a sense that will be positive for the teachers, because then they'll have a paying relationship with, which by the way is a great thing, because having a paying relationship means you get real support, better support, etc. So that company now, by the way, is profitable, and they did precisely that, and they have figured out how to charge, and thousands of schools are paying, and in the end, it's going to be tens of thousands.
That's amazing. I love that thought experiment of, well, would they pay anything? And if so, then this is just a pricing question. This isn't really a business model question.
It does go to show as well, Dan, that having scale is a great way to start. So, to answer that earlier question, I would say more often than not, the best answer is to scale, get customers. Once you know that you have 10 to 100 customers who really love you, and you know that when you scale, you'll have great retention and great growth. Remember the definition, the intersection of those being the definition of product market fit.
Awesome. So I think we might have our last question here. This one's from Nina. And she said, Geoff, is math education too saturated with products? Is there room in math for a non-game, non-drill and kill product to succeed? What do you think?
I always hesitate to say anything is saturated. If we had said that in 2007, we would not have funded Dropbox. Yep. Where it sort of seemed like the file sharing space was saturated. I think the answer is, if you come up with a significantly better solution that really works, then saturation doesn't matter, because for the most part, the best product will win. And there are a lot of math products out there, I fully concur, and that doesn't mean it will be easy, but that doesn't mean there's not room for improvement.
I love that. And, just to speak to our data, we see teachers going and adopting new math products in the Clever library all the time. It's one of our most popular categories. So there is still interest. There are still people looking for new things and trying them out. So, and I think that that's a really great transition into a quick plug for our next webinar. The CEO of PureGrade, who went through Imagine K-12, he's incredible, and is in the Clever library, will be getting kind of deep with me on how do you get that free teacher adoption, and I'm sure we'll also talk a little bit about how do you convert those free users to paid as well. Geoff, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely incredible. The thoughts and the insights you shared. I've had a blast.
It's been a real pleasure, Dan. Always get to talk to you.
Yeah, and if you have any, like I said to everyone on the webinar, we'll follow up with a recording. There's a handout available. And if you have any questions, you want to learn more about Clever, the library, what we're doing, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm just dan@clever.com and would love to get you the information you need to help your company grow. All right, we'll see you soon, Geoff.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.